Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Easter Dr. Bud Marr.
Heyo.
That sounds cumbersome. I'm Dr. Bud Marr, and it's Easter weekend.
That's right. You're like the Easter bunny, but Dr. Marr.
And cuter.
Oh, well, we are on radio, so no one can verify or discount that. Either way, this is The Uncommon Good, no matter what time of year it is, and we're so happy to have all of you with us here on The Uncommon Good. We are in Iowa, between the two rivers. Depending on when you're listening to this, we're either between Holy Saturday or it is full-on Easter. Either way, the celebratory mood, Bud, is already chiming in or is in full swing. And, you know, folks, every time we do Lent, I'm not saying that it feels like Lent will go on to forever or something like this, but you do eventually get into sort of Lent mode, and it's always a beautiful disturbance of that mode when we get here into the Holy Triduum, but then, of course, Easter and the grand celebration. So here is us at the show wishing you the highest blessings of the year precisely because it's Easter, and I hope that Lent coming into the great celebration and the great feast has been everything that God had planned for you in his great providence.
Yeah, I hope it was okay to shout out Easter. I know the show is broadcast at different times over the weekends, but I figured the first listeners would be Holy Saturday, really close to the Easter Vigil. Then all the rest would be in full Eastertide.
Absolutely.
I won't say, it's funny, around the house this Lent, my kids were pretty cute because they'd be playing in the backyard and like CJ would run in, 6 years old. Dad, Gemma said the A word. And I was like, what is going on in the backyard? But they were really policing the use of Alleluia. Yeah. So it was cute.
It's funny, too, because this year my kids went to one of the Eastern Catholic services during Lent. Yeah. And, of course, in Eastern Catholicism, they up the Alleluias for spiritual reasons, similar but different, right? Their idea is that you need the strength of that word to get you through the fast. So, at any rate, it's like it's for the same sort of reason, but you know, a different sort of take on it. So, at any rate, my kids kept saying the A word as well, and I was like, okay.
Well, it's apropos that you mentioned the Eastern rites because today we're discussing the liturgy. So you allowed me to do, I was going to say a U-turn. I don't think a U-turn, a left turn into traffic last week where we'd been doing the series this spring on technology. But we pivoted, or I would say supplemented.
Yes, there you go.
Where we started to talk about Vatican II. And we mentioned last week a lot has been said about Vatican II, but I was really pleased with how the conversation went because I feel like we're interweaving those technology and media questions with the most recent ecumenical council in the church. But today, our topic is specifically Sacrosanctum Concilium. If you're taking notes at home, you can look up how to spell it later. But it's Vatican II's Constitution on the Liturgy, so it should be a lot of fun.
Well, and I think it's interesting that I'm sure there is that if we go and look, maybe we should have done more research. It's been a busy week. That you could have pointed out that there's people who think about this in terms of media. But, you know, I'm going to caution a guess that even when people talk about media in terms of Vatican II, it's usually about mass media itself. So the noun media, of course, we almost always mean now the news or something similar to that instead of mediums, right? So the mediums of communication. And I think that the liturgy and Eastertide, Bud, are perfect times to point out, you know, the liturgy is the medium, right, by which we, anamnesis, right, we recall, we remember, we sit there at the foot of Calvary again, right, and at the foot of the empty tomb. And then, so, you know, the liturgy is that medium by which we approach Christ. And as we pointed out, I think it was McLuhan that pointed out, Jesus Christ, of course, is the one person, the one entity that is the medium and the message all at the same time. Yeah. So it makes sense that's the case. But then it's also interesting to think of a council for the first time being expressed through the modern mediums of communication. So not just that news people were reporting on it, but, you know, the first time in history that people watched a council from anywhere in the world. I mean, not everybody saw it. I'm not saying something like that, but it was possible to watch a council, which, of course, through most of human history, you would only catch wind of it later. So this and much besides that we get to talk about, but more than anything, happy Easter, or happy soon-to-be Easter, depending on when you're listening to this, I should say. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. And one more time, either happy right before Easter, if you're catching the first live rendering of the show on Holy Saturday. Everyone else, happy Easter full on. But we, of course, have been talking about technology and religion, and then we made a sub-series, not the Subway series. That's the Mets versus the Yankees. A sub-series about this, Vatican II, but really Vatican II considered with media, technology, and religion as the primary lens to look at those things. And so today, we're going to look at the liturgy, the medium of all mediums, precisely because Vatican II's document on the liturgy had a far-ringing consequence, to say the least.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and yeah, I was worried during that intro because you were giving us so much meat to chew on that I thought, will we have to do the additional sessions, like segments? Bo's taking care of it all, but I think you kicked it off wonderfully, and it's funny, you mentioned folks like actually watching the council take place. I mean, there were people sort of waiting for newspapers to be printed the morning after to hear what was going on. And in the wake of the council, or afterwards, so Pope Benedict XVI, in a famous Christmas address, he talked about how the media after the council made interpretation more difficult. And we can save that topic for a later episode, but you can see how even the way people receive the messaging is going to influence their understanding of what's taking place.
Right, but before, I mean, this gets right into it, is I think we don't understand that in prior eras, the only way you could sort of interpret something as it went along was if you were there listening to it. Nearly everything else, you had to wait for a document to happen. And so whatever else we want to say about the iterations of time and things like this, you know, by the time, especially the faithful, I can at least say this, but most of the world received anything about a council, it was sort of completed in its format. And all of the sort of discussions and difficulties that went into it, right, they sort of come out at least full-born as the council fathers would have thought of them. Yeah. But here, people were getting expectations as it was going along. And I think that the liturgy is a primary place, and that's why I think this document is going to be so interesting to talk about, that people started sort of front-loading ideas about what this document would need to say, not what it was even currently saying, precisely because of the medium by which the council was communicated had a sort of live element that had never happened before. Vatican I didn't even really have this.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I do this with a lot of episodes, but I almost feel like I need to give a bit of a disclaimer this morning. I mean, there's the warning in sacred scripture, the New Testament, where it says, like, don't use too many words because we'll give an account for each word that we utter. Yeah, I know. But beyond that, so there's this wonderful book called The Heresy of Formlessness. We could do a radio reading roundup on this book, but the author, Martin Mosebach, he talks about, like, one unfortunate thing in the world as we live in it today is that the liturgy is no longer second nature to us. And so, I mean, I think we've all had this experience. You're sitting at church in the pew and a particular song is sung and you're like, this one's not my favorite. Right. Or, why is the priest doing this gesture at this moment? Well, I'm a liturgy nerd, so I'm probably more prone to that. But Mosebach's point is that liturgy should sort of be like the water we swim in. It's in the Middle Ages, even up to the early parts of the 20th century, like, I really think it's fair to say, like, most folks didn't go to Mass and think, like, oh, this could have been done differently. And so we talked last week, like, I think Vatican II presents challenges. That doesn't mean, like, oh, it's raised these difficulties or we're facing these problems, therefore, like, we've got to chuck it out or something. But I do think with the liturgy document, again, you get into this constitution, some really good meat there, a lot of substance, but it has sort of like, it's drawn our attention to the liturgy in a way that we maybe didn't look at it so closely beforehand.
And I mean, this starts to be the Pandora's box, not about Vatican II itself or any of its documents. this is where I think the media and medium lens comes in, because people will go, what, are you saying that no one ever thought about the liturgy before that? And you're like, well, no. And certainly,
Of course not.
I mean, like, Russia has its old believer dilemma. I mean, there's huge things where this happens, where entire parts of the church actually go into schism with each other because of sort of arguments of the liturgy. So let's not act like that's not the case. But it is certainly the case that because you can now switch channels, let's just talk about the fact that when you listen to the radio or watch TV, automatically the sort of way in which the medium is approaching you, you have an immediate choice. Do I like this? But about the same event, you can actually change channels. I know everyone talks about we have 1,000 channels. Used to, there's only 3 or 4. But even then, right, if there was a big event and news was covering it, you could choose to switch the channel to have a different perspective on it. Yeah. And so the sort of self-awareness that Vatican II has because of the conditions of the mediums by which it was happening is something radically different that I think when you talk about what's unleashed at Vatican II are considerations that basically had to happen at some point because of the new world we lived in, but they weren't. They caused self-reflection, but people weren't reflective about that self-reflection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is where, as Catholics, I think we can step back and really be thankful for some of the gifts in the Catholic Church that you only find there. So you talk about switching channels. There are a lot of Protestant congregations and communities where they've almost gone completely live streamed, or like their television broadcast is a huge thing. And there's almost a complete continuity between used to being in the building. Maybe after COVID, I have friends who have told me we just watch at home and we get sort of like the same benefits out of it. When we talk about the medium and the message, like we could spend a lot of time in theological reflection just on the idea that our Lord, when he knew his death was approaching and before his ascension into heaven, he left his presence with us, or a medium of his presence, and it was bread and wine. Consecrated bread and wine, which becomes his body and blood. Again, we don't have to come out like ecumenical guns firing, but like that's a unique gift in the Catholic Church. You could talk about orthodoxy and valid sacraments, but it also draws us back into community because you can only encounter Christ in that way.
I mean, I'll get very dorkily scientific. When you look at a video or a picture of the Eucharist, you are not looking at the Eucharist. You are looking at a light capture on a lens, either through photograph, analog or digital, or streamed over. You are looking at light patterns, which is not the same as being physically in the room and having the immediate light reflecting off of the substances, the bread and the wine, the hosts, hit your eyes. And folks, you go, what are you talking about? But this is why in the Middle Ages, Bud, that's why they raised the host, is they knew that their eyes were communing with the host. Yeah. You want the actual rays of light bouncing off the sacrament to hit your eyes, folks. And you can't do that through television or a photograph. Yeah. And it's funny because no one ever thinks that no one looks at a painting of the Eucharist, Bud, and goes, oh, I'm communing with the Eucharist. But that's what it is so at any rate, the point gets at, Vatican II was hitting on stuff, and I think you even see this in the document itself, but it was so new in the water they were swimming in that immediate time that I just think it's timely for us to start reflecting back on their self-reflection, if that makes sense.
Well, and all Christians emphasize the incarnation. Like you'll talk to other confessional Christians, and they'll say, the fact that the Son of God became flesh and dwelt among us is the linchpin of history. And God was incarnate. He was Emmanuel, God with us, God in the flesh. Catholicism extends the mystery of the incarnation, and it's not only with the Eucharist. The Eucharist is sort of like the highest, the pinnacle of that reality. But you have all sorts of accounts in the early church of people being touched by relics and then healed, like dead bodies coming back to life. And that's where, man, I heard an amazing, I know we're not getting to the document yet, but I heard an amazing homily this week where the priest was talking about when Moses wanted to see God. And God basically says in effect, like, you cannot see me and live, right?
Correct.
And so he says, I will pass by this crevice in a rock and you can gain a glimpse of my back. And Moses, like again, that language is an analogy, like we'd want to like understand that properly. But Moses just gets like the slightest glimpse of God, and his face is so bright that he has to wear a veil when he talks to the people. Mm-hmm. So you think we asked ourselves, like, why doesn't God just show up in the room? He's given us his very presence, his body, blood, soul, and divinity in the sacraments at Mass. And frankly, for now, that's all we can handle, I think.
I think you're right. And I mean, but this gets to it right, that the same reason why everyone knows that the recording of a band is different than seeing them live, because it's the literal air pushing at you from that thing. In a similar way, right, to be just in the room with the sacrament is to experience it different than seeing like it on a photo or hearing about it. But even that's already veiled. And so you go, why would you add like double and triple veils over what God has in his providence provided a veil for us to come among his presence, like you say?
But this segues right into Sacrosanctum Concilium, this document on the liturgy at the Second Vatican Council. I think for me, Bo, the first phrase that really jumps out and I think builds momentum in what this document is tackling is paragraph 10. There's good stuff before that, obviously, but there the Council Fathers described the Mass or the liturgy as the source and summit of the Church's life. Nevertheless, the liturgy is the summit toward which the activity of the Church is directed. It is also the source from which all its power flows. Now, in my experience, Bo, there are, again, other Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, I think, who kind of balk at that idea. So in some cases, you have, I think, our Protestant brethren who they say, like, Catholicism is too much about formal liturgy. And so they have this idea, like, we gather together wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in Jesus' name, he's in their midst.
Some reason always at coffee shops.
And now the coffee shops have been blended with the sanctuaries. But they, you know, you don't want to have this formality because you have this kind of like extemporaneous sort of like God naturally draws this response out of you. So that's one side. And then I think there are Catholics, and both of these ideas, well-intentioned, of course, but who say like the real task of the Christian life is serving those in need. So we're called to be servant leaders, to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those in prison. And so in that kind of idea, again, painting with broad strokes, the idea is that sort of the liturgy or Mass is sort of a warm-up for what's really important. Mm-hmm. But here, the Council Fathers say it's the source and summit of the Church's life. I have a couple ideas. I think they're related to what we were just saying, where God gives us his very life. But what does this draw to mind for you? Well,
I mean, 2 things immediately. One is, of course, heaven is going to be worship. So how is it the case that, like, worshiping God on earth is not at least the most important preparatory thing that you're going to do for eternity? It's also this idea, of course, that like time passes, but eternity is forever and instantaneous and always present. And so whatever it is that you can do to enter into eternity seems to trump all other things and make those other things the foundation of everything else that you would do. So, you know, liturgy is actually eternal. Our liturgies here on earth is a portal, as it were, to something that is always going on and is perpetually going on. So even when you're serving the poor, the liturgy of heaven is, in a way, the thing that like uplifts you to be able to do so, for instance. Yep. And again, this is not to get too much in the weeds already, but you know, I think what's interesting with all of the Vatican II documents, because of living in the print and radio and TV culture, you know, there's entire books about the argumentation and the sort of jockeying that goes into the final documents, right? Yeah. And so I think it's interesting that of all of the sort of warp and weft of different factions that were trying to have dominant takes on what this document needed to say, that coming out of the gate, this is the one that really focused it. And funny enough, I'm going to say this to maybe ruffle some feathers. This really is the sort of newbies. It was resourcement people that really thought this was important, because there's some ways that I was even sort of more traditional, not liturgical traditionalist, but more sort of like traditional type of folks that would have found that language not alienating, but certainly different than the way it was put, like maybe just 100 years before.
Yeah. Joseph Ratzinger / Pope Benedict XVI, in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, he has this really fascinating reflection on a part of the Old Testament. And sometimes I think when we call to mind Bible stories, we make these assumptions about what's going on And, even about some of the details. It's funny when this time of year rolls around and there are these different little traditions, like the whole account of Veronica's veil. I have to ask myself, is that in the Gospels or is that something that we passed on in other ways, right? You see this with the Old Testament. So you think about the Exodus out of slavery. Mm-hmm. What's that story about? What's the historical narrative? I raised this in class with students, and they're like, oh, well, the people are in bondage in Egypt, and God brings them out of bondage. He leads them to freedom. Well, Ratzinger Benedict, he points out that what is the freedom to which God is calling the people? Well, if you remember, there's a moment where Pharaoh is going to allow the people to go out, and Moses insists, we need everything. They end up plundering the Egyptians, but before that, they have to have their cattle and things. And then God himself, when he promises to bring the people out of slavery, he says to them what? He says, I will bring you to, and I'll do this in class, fill in the blank. And some of the kids will guess the promised land, again, freedom, some sort they have these different guesses, but God says, I will take you on eagle's wings and bring you to myself. Mm-hmm. And so the point that Ratzinger makes is that when God calls the people out of Egypt, it's not simply to this new political reality that they'll experience in the promised land. They're called to sacrifice. And that gets to your point about preparation for the heavenly liturgy, but even beyond that, being drawn into it now. There's no other more important thing that we do. And it already has all these political implications that we don't have to sort of fabricate or point out. So you think we're gathering around an altar table where people from every tongue, tribe, and nation, all sorts of cultural backgrounds, are fed, and you lose these distinctions between the very rich and the very poor. Mm-hmm. And there's no exclusionary aspect on the basis of ethnicity and things like that. And so God is at Mass, he's coming to us, but he's also creating the world as it's called to be.
Yeah, and so I think that's so great about we get lost in the weeds of what is the sort of condition that makes the end or the goal possible. So you have to be brought out of Egypt with all of your cattle, with the Egyptian gold, because you need to worship me, the true God. Similarly, but when people talk about the 10 Commandments, which, by the way, they're not numbered as 10 Commandments in either of the parts of the Old Testament, what is the first thing talked about with the 10 Commandments? It is, I am the Lord your God. Yeah. And so everything that follows is the conditions to make that true. How do I make that you are my Lord, O God? I follow these rules. Okay, and so in a similar way, all the questions about the liturgy, it's not about you guys are, like I said, taking yourself out of the world and, making it all about yourselves, but you start to go, a source and summit is to say, how do we make everything else about the condition of being properly the Lord's and worshiping him?
Yeah, and that's where, with the source and summit language, I think, I don't have my Latin Vatican II documents in front of me, but I think when it says source, the term there is fons, F-O-N-S, and so it's sometimes pronounced or translated fount, where it's the fount from which our life flows, and that's where it gets back to the real presence, because we talk about the sacred blood of Christ, and think about that for a moment, how those outside of our community hear something like, at Mass, we commune with the blood of Christ, right? Mm-hmm. But the blood of Christ is our very life. If you think about the reality of the body, if we start losing blood or too much blood, we're not going to be living for very much longer. And so we can't take this seriously enough. St. John Henry Newman, who I've studied a great deal, he says prayer in the spiritual life is like oxygen. Mm-hmm. You cannot live without it. St. Padre Pio says it would be easier for the world to survive without the sun than without the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And these are men who did amazing things in their society in terms of educating people, serving the poor, the sick, etc. But their lifeblood was the Mass, and it's the lifeblood of our communities, our parishes.
Yeah, but so that's all that this document said, right? And there's no controversy, and who would even argue with that? Well, I know that we're getting ready to go to the break here, but I think that that's actually sort of a helpful way to put it. You read some of this document, and especially that, and you go, well, who could have any sort of objections, or who could even come up with some of the, there's no way that this caused any craziness or zaniness or ripples throughout history. But I think that is a good way to say, of course, the source and summit. Well, hey, that actually it wasn't revolutionary at its time, but it was very important to put it that way. But then the way that starts to be expounded, it's not as simple maybe as those two wonderful sentences make it. So this is the Uncommon Good. We're going to talk more about this when we get back. Thank you for listening, and stick with us. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Wonderful to have you with us. Bud, we're talking about a subset of a subset, our series on religion and technology. We're talking about Vatican II and looking at its documents through the lens of mediums, technology, communication, etc. So we, for 20 minutes, led up to one phrase in the document on the liturgy. I think we can go at a faster pace now. But Source and Summit, who's going to complain that the liturgy is the source and summit of our faith? Well,
that's right. Well, there are other parts of the document that have kicked up a lot more discussion and debate just simply about how to understand and apply the insight that's being taught. Now, if you've ever taken some time to just even peek at the documents of Vatican II, you'll probably notice they're quite verbose. And I point that out because scholars say, like, really at the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, the church spoke in a different manner than it had in previous councils. So most previous councils, they generally promulgated canons, say C-A-N-O-N-S, which are sort of like legally binding statements. So here's crisply and clearly what we believe. If someone rejects this, let them be anathema. That sort of approach, like here's what's being asserted. Here's kind of like the legal consequence of not accepting it. At Vatican II, so when you get into the scholarship, there will be writers who say the genre is more like panegyric, which is an older, like it goes back to Hellenistic culture. But the idea is that instead of having more like legal juridical statements with consequences for not accepting them, it really is idealistic statements. So it kind of, you ever hear someone like, we say we have to cast a vision that everyone will follow. Yeah. And that's what you see at Vatican II.
Lots of vision casting.
Yes, vision casting. And because of that, there's sometimes a little more wrangling about, well, what do we do with this? And one of the statements around which this document pivots, most commentators will say this is like the heart of the document. This is paragraph 14. It is very much the wish of the church that all the faithful should be led to take that full, conscious, and active participation in liturgical celebrations, which is demanded by the very nature of the liturgy. Now, Bo, I'll pass the mic to you real quickly here, but just one comment. Why would it be necessary to say this? Well, you have to remember we have over 2,000 bishops voting on this document, so there are different perspectives being brought to it. But just kind of simplistically, we don't have time to break this down. The Mass is beautiful. We say it's the Mass of the ages, right? And it's passed down by the apostles, through the traditions of the church. There are still times where popes and councils have said, how do we reinvigorate the experience of the liturgy? I would kind of emphasizing that word experience. And so at the time of the council, there were conversations about how in some parts of the church, some parts of the world, sometimes the liturgy was celebrated in such a way that the faithful gathered ended up being more like spectators. And this is a case where I am painting a very broad strokes. Like in the early 20th century, there are places where there are vibrant Catholic communities. You read something like Eamon Duffy's Stripping of the Altars, even in the Middle Ages, like where we have these kind of ideas about how the liturgy was functioning. People have a strong devotion in all sorts of ways. Attendance levels are high. But there was this sense that sometimes at the Mass, that the faithful would be drawn, say, into like para-liturgical devotions, where the sort of sense was that the priest was doing the important work at the altar, and most Catholics accepted that, like, oh, what he's doing is highly significant. He's taking care of that part. I'm back here observing what's going on, but sort of like participating maybe through praying the rosary, some other devotion. In some cases, like Holy Communion was received outside of the celebration of the Mass. And so even before Vatican II, like with someone like Pius X, Pius XII, these popes, they're saying, we want to celebrate the liturgy in such a way and form the people in such a way that they're actually praying the prayers of the Mass and they're united with what's taking place at the altar. So the goal here with full conscious and active participation is, how do we make that happen?
Well, and I think there's two things that immediately go to media and technology on this. One, like you said, it's interesting about how and why some things end up in writing throughout human history, because we've been with writing for a long time, and mostly, even the history, it's written mostly. Okay, so legalistically, if that's the genre, what you're putting in written documents is statements that have the force of have performative force, right? Mm-hmm. So when you put canons and anathemas, you go, this was said and declared, and you should know it.
Oh yeah,
right. So it like has it's sort of perpetuating what was said orally. Funny enough, the panegyric style, of course, when it used to be in the past, the idea is like, okay, well, you could like you had to be there, sort of idea. But so for the first time in history, I'm going to argue. Vatican II, imagine, well, what if we wrote documents that we intended to be read over and over again and interpreted? Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very different thing than trying to write clearly, in a canon, this was what was said, and this is like the performative weight of what was just done. But this also comes up with, say the phrase again real quick for me.
Let me just make sure I get this right. So it's the wish of the church that all the faithful should be led to take full, conscious, and active part in liturgical celebrations.
Full, conscious, and active part. So, of course, that is that's what's being argued over still to this day. But, this is where I think technology gets into understanding some of this. Even with written culture before the printing press, even with the rites that were written, the majority of all Catholics, literate or illiterate alike, this was engaged orally. And so even when you had the sort of dynamic of some things said out loud and some things not, and even, all of that sort of stuff, the oral performance of liturgy made it where active participation was understood in a completely different way that I don't even know if we can ever truly get back to, Bud. Like, we can sort of like try to understand, but it's hard to look back through that veil. With the printing press, and very much so with the liturgy that happens at the Tridentine Mass after the Council of Trent, for the first time, people go, goodness, with all these Protestants throwing out all of these pamphlets and all of these new rites via the technology of the printing press, which means they're endlessly repeatable and they can be thrown wherever throughout Europe. Catholicism's like, well, we need to put this in writing so that like it's repeatable and the same. And so what leads to Vatican II in this document is basically 500 years of dealing with this idea.
Yeah.
And so what I like to throw out when people go like, oh, this document had to happen because there wasn't active participation, right? It's like you said, paraliturgical, all these things like this. And I go, I bet you, like again, we don't know, time machine sort of deal. I bet you like in 1907, when people were going to like 20-minute Sunday masses and there were like 12 of them at the local parish, I bet you all of those people thought Father was reverent as long as he read the text. And because like that's what being faithful and conscious meant. And so if you went and you were like, okay, good, I'm at the place where Father is reading the text and doing right by the text, so I'm going to pray along while I'm here. It wasn't until really, I think, radio and television started to make people in the pews go, hey, wait a minute, like this isn't a lecture. So what's funny is like they talk about active participation, but I'm going to argue that what people started to see were performances of the Mass.
Yeah.
And actually people sat down in their pews and started to watch it like a television show.
Yeah.
But so active participation starts to be this really interesting thing, Bud, because I think some people thought they were actively participating if they were watching something, which would be different than being like, I was present when someone was reading. So anyway, you start to get these huge media genre confusions. And so that word, active participation, but active participation is different if you are in an oral conversation, if you are reading something, if you're witnessing it on radio and television, and now in our age, active participation in the digital world, different than all of those things. And this is why there is such adamant confusion over this one phrase.
Well, and to kind of pick on an idea, and one that I think maybe gets it wrong or goes too far, and Bo, you've pointed out how once televisions are in our homes, we experience things like the liturgy differently, events like that. So I think there are things going on in our culture that push this understanding of active participation, but there's this real push after the council to say like, well, if the faithful are going to participate, they need more roles in the Mass, right? And so lay faithful lecturing, congregational singing, things like this become more widespread after the council. Ironically, when you have that idea of participation, I think it's kind of funny that, so up to that point, through much of Catholic history, there are minor orders, like 7 minor orders?
Yeah, porter,
like exorcist, acolyte, subdeacon, deacon. Those are mostly eliminated. Deacon remains a transitional office towards the priesthood, But there's this push, and we see this at Mass today, like Uncle...
Permanent deacons were later. Yes. But yes.
Uncle Joe's an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. I like reading the Old Testament at Mass, all these things.
Uh-huh.
I'm not saying any of those things are terrible. Like, don't just hear me this morning or whenever you're listening as a grumpy person. But I do think there's a sense where we can, any celebration of the liturgy is going to have to be ordered in such a way. Mm-hmm. You compare this to like going to a football game. I'm a huge Nebraska Husker fan. I've mentioned this on the show previously. If I go to Memorial Stadium and I'm sitting in the south end zone, I'm wearing my red, maybe my face is even painted. Am I participating in that event? I mean, this is sort of a live question. Am I participating more if I knock over the referee, steal a shirt, and start making calls, right?
Right.
There's just this sense of a certain ordered operation of how some events take place. Like each person has their role. And I think good theologians have pointed this out. We don't raise the dignity of the faithful by sort of like making them appear more clerical. So all that to say, I'm not disagreeing necessarily with the concerns leading up to the council. With the emphasis on full conscious and active participation, this is a statement of the church, and I fully endorse it and can get behind it. I think it's worth asking, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And that's, again, I mean, Ratzinger's coming up a lot today's episode, but like he says, in every era of the church, the telos, or the end to which we are seeking, was contemplatio. Mm-hmm. We wanted to be drawn into the contemplation of God. And sometimes that's done best not through a spectator mode, but through a silent receptive mode. And maybe we've lost some of that.
Well, so the analogy that I'm thinking of is, so clearly as we've gone further along in history having roads with cars on them, bud, what's one concern that has consistently popped up? It's like, we need to remember the importance of pedestrians and realize that pedestrians interact with roadways too. And so we should do something about that. But it would be silly to be like, how we're going to, regain the dignity of the pedestrian? We're going to let them be in the road with cars.
Yeah.
No. That would be pure murder. And so to mix, right, the role of car and pedestrian on the road would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
What you have to say is like, so we're going to do things like make walkways. We're going to make it where, you can start to think about all the ways that we've done a much better job of saying right of way to pedestrians, lighting for pedestrians, all of these things like this. But what we haven't done is put them beside cars and said, well, you're all equal now. We've done our duty towards pedestrians. I'm not trying to say that the modern Mass does that to that extent, but I am saying that I think those are considerations. Is to make pedestrians more car-like doesn't help them out. To actually make pedestrians even more a separate entity than vehicle, so that they have their regard and dignity, really demonstrated clearly, that's very elemental. Mm-hmm. And I think that you see that with the liturgy, that I'm actually, with this document, I'm throwing out as a good thing that people started to go, no, there really is the dignity of the role of the faithful.
Yeah.
They are not an afterthought, but they're unique and distinct, which would make it, to sort of just flatten it out as like everybody is somewhat of a cleric, is to actually miss how important being one of the faithful is.
Well, and I feel like I'm stealing a few of your ideas this morning, but one interesting way to get at this question and maybe untie the Gordian knot that gets, clasped is to over-accept the idea. And what I mean by that is we get kind of bogged down in this trench warfare. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when we have these conversations, you've pointed out, you want to talk about a change to our churches or the media with which we experience the liturgy. Talk about pews, right?
Yes.
And pews are ubiquitous in churches now.
Out with the pews.
Some folks will think like this is only an Eastern Catholic thing, because you do go to some Eastern liturgies today and there are no pews. But you look at paintings, again, of the Mass being celebrated in the Middle Ages, and there will be these beautiful renderings where the priest is reverently celebrating at the altar, and you'll see the congregation or the faithful just gathered around. Some are kneeling, some are fainting, and that was more the experience, and that created a certain kind of ethos. So John Henry Newman came into the Catholic Church like really midway through his life. He lived to be 89 years of age. He came into the church at age 44, and in one of his novels, he's got this beautiful depiction or narration of the fictional character's first experience of the Catholic Mass. And the guy goes into church and he talks about how it's this living organism, but there's not the same kind of like structured like things in neat boxes that you see at, say, Protestant services. So some folks are at a side altar, others are celebrating a particular devotion. It's actually not Mass, but it's benediction at the main altar. And so there are all these things taking place, and it's not like there has to be this strict formality, like when you're at Mass, you do X gesture at Y moment. But folks are being drawn to the altar, but there's not the same sort of like everyone find their seating assignment. And it's really this moving thing.
It's like why they had bells, right? Like the bell rings, you know that it's time to kneel because there's so in it, like, oh yes, I want there to be some pews and chairs. I want it to be that like if people who are injured can sit down. I'm not saying anything silly like this. However, it truly is the case. You start to see pews come in when text domination starts to begin. And so it starts to seem like, oh, this is some sort of lecture. When it becomes radio and television land, and especially when we make the new Mass, 1970, and folks, it's usually either 30 minutes or an hour long, and there seems to be breaks. Maybe some would say a commercial break. You start to see that it's like, oh, we better get all the chairs around so people can watch the performance. And I do think that, like, it's like you said, if you want to really sort of get into this active participation, you're like, well, maybe get rid of the pews and have people actually do, like be there, walking around, mulling about, etc. It'd be so revolutionary now. I don't know if it would work, but I do throw this out as a thought experiment that pews are in no way, I'm guarantee you, but there's not something in the document that goes, there must be pews. But we act like that's more elemental than maybe even like some of the prayers in the Mass.
Well, and when you say that phrase, we act like in the document it says such and such. That becomes a huge thing after the council. So again, the council wraps up in 1965. The Novus Ordo Missae, the new order of the Mass, is promulgated, I want to say 1969. It's like Advent, 1970, right around there that it starts to be universal in the church, right? And we'll have to save this for next week's episode. I'm looking at the time. I don't think we can tackle this one. But there are these questions about, like, there are these changes that everyone takes for granted. Say something as simple as the priest facing the people during the Eucharistic prayer that we assume, like, oh, Vatican II called for this. And when we get into the document itself, it's a bit more nuanced than that. But all that to say, and I'm going to kick off a big conversation, and we'll probably have to sneak preview it for next week. But we have that emphasis on full conscious and active participation. And then section 3 of the document, a major section beginning at paragraph 21, it gets into the idea. So if that is the case, it is the wish of the church to undertake a careful general reform of the liturgy in order that the Christian people may be more certain to derive an abundance of graces from it. Now here's the challenge, Bo, or here's like the vision cast. This is maybe harder to pull off in practice, but the next sentence says, for the liturgy is made up of unchangeable elements divinely instituted and of elements that are subject to change. A couple paragraphs later, there must be no innovations to the liturgy unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly requires them. So again, a big idea right before the break, but it kicks off this general reform of the liturgy. It says it has to be careful. No changes should be made unless the church genuinely requires them. And then this distinction, I think this is the tough one, Bo. The liturgy is made up of unchangeable elements divinely instituted. So there are some things we can't touch. Like,
right.
You take away the bread and the wine, Mass isn't happening, right?
Right. The creed.
The creed, reading of sacred scripture. But some elements are subject to change. And that's the project that's undertaken in the decades since the time of the council.
And so even in the sort of in the release of the documents of the council, do they get all released at the same time or do they come out at different times?
No, so this was the earliest one it's not the earliest topic that's brought up, but it's the earliest one that's brought to a vote. So there are these fall sessions, 62, 63, 64, 65, and it's the most controversial topic. So funny enough, liturgy we debate a lot now, but at the council, it was one of there were topics like the use of Latin and things that kicked up a lot of dust.
Right.
But the vote was vast majority. And it's things like the questions about other religions, like relationship to the Jews, religious liberty that it takes, it's like the midnight hour before it's approved.
That to me is interesting. And again, this is where when people will say, oh, we feel like there was like the Vatican documents, but then there was the spirit of the Vatican Council. And that is, language that quote unquote both sides bring up. But to me, that's something that, we're obviously
another word for spirit? Medium.
Oh, this is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, we keep marching along and we keep ensuring people that they'll know what we're talking about next week, because there is no way we finish talking about that important of a document within Vatican II. And so this is stage one of our sub-conversation within our larger talk. So yes, religion, technology, mediums, communication. Talking about the Second Vatican Council through that lens, and then, of course, bringing this up in talking about the document on the liturgy. But I do think that the phrases we covered today, in some ways, are the most elemental ones.
Yeah.
And so clearing that ground can allow us next week to talk about I think what my point is, we'll go quicker through the document, but I do feel like these sort of source and summit, conscious participation, and then this idea of how the roadmap of reform was laid out, those really are still three things we're talking about to this day, and what that means to do that faithfully. And sometimes when people go like, why aren't you guys, like to traditionalists, for instance, why aren't you guys, quote unquote, accepting the council? You go, well, it might be a little bit more complicated than that, right? Yeah. Those are three huge things with that certainly, if it's in a panegyric style, demand to be interpreted. And so I guess in talking through these things with you, I start to realize why this is still so much with us and why we're still having these conversations.
Yeah, it's funny. I know I'm most guilty of this, but you and I, when we plan the shows, we'll be like, well, this week we'll discuss this topic. And you'll go, I think this might require 2-3 episodes. I'll be like, no. And inevitably, I should learn my lesson by now.
Well,
the minute
that we do that, we'll actually get it all done in half an episode. We won't have enough to talk about. So, Bud, tell people, if we want to make sure that they can join us with the prayer life here on Iowa Catholic Radio, when and how they could do so.
If you're more of an early bird than I am, you can wake up at 4 a.m. to pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. That's followed right by the Holy Rosary with Mother Angelica at 4:30. Later in the morning, we've got the Rosary at 10 a.m., followed by Daily Mass. 2:57 p.m. is the Divine Mercy Chaplet. And then the end of the day, 8:30 in the evening, the Holy Rosary again with Father Groeschel. You can, of course, pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere, using the Iowa Catholic Radio app.
And folks, during this great season of Easter, where we show thanksgiving for what Christ has done for us in his life, death, and resurrection, we hope that you find time to pray for Iowa Catholic Radio as an extension of that ministry of proclaiming that truth for people. And Iowa Catholic Radio on 24/7 a day, or I should say ready to be on at the flip of a button, whether that be in the car, on iowacatholicradio.com. But this ministry, of course, is not simply the people behind the mics, behind the boards, or behind the desks. It is your ministry as well. You make it possible, and you make that possible through your prayers, of which we are so grateful for, of all the people praying for us. You make it possible through your time and volunteer time. So many wonderful volunteers who do so much great work for Iowa Catholic Radio. But, of course, the necessity of your material donations that make the station able to stay open and able to keep repeating with resounding joy the message that Jesus Christ is risen. You make that possible as well. So if you can prayerfully donate, prayerfully contemplate how much you should donate in order to keep this going on. Every little amount helps, but of course the big amounts help a lot as well. You can donate at iowacatholicradio.com safe and securely with the donate button. You can call 515-223-1150 or text 515-223-1150 to make those donations and make this wonderful station keep being that ministry that proclaims as loud as it can the glorious truth that Jesus Christ is risen today, because it is either Saturday right before Easter or it's Easter and beyond, and it's just a great thing to embody. But again, talking about the liturgy, the source and summit of our faith, I think very appropriate for Easter week. I hope your Lent has been profitable and fruitful, and I hope that we're able to celebrate wondrously together in this new Eastertide.
Same to you both. Thanks. Blessings to our listeners.
So, folks, as you know, this is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in our families, in our city, our state, our nation, the whole world, the whole solar system, the whole galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. Jesus Christ is risen today, and we should all be glad for it. This is the Uncommon Good, and we will be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast.